Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today we are going to talk about the intuitive pantser. I know a lot of you have waited a really long time for this video, so thank you so much for your patience. If you haven't seen my previous videos in this series, I recommend that you watch the original video first. But if you don't feel like watching that video right now, or you've already seen it and you just need a quick overview, the four types are built on two continuums. The first continuum is intuitive to methodological. The intuitive type means a writer that sort of uses their gut feeling. They sort of feel out how the flow should go, sort of the rhythm of the story. The methodological type uses structural systems, scene structure, things like that, methodology in order to craft their stories. The other continuum is pantser versus plotter. A plotter would be somebody who plans their novel in advance, writing out scenes, plot points to whatever degree works for them. And then the pantser sort of flies by the seat of their pants. They don't really plan in advance. You might also call this a discovery writer. So those are the two continuums, and that's where we get the four types, which are methodological plotter, methodological pantser, intuitive plotter, and intuitive pantser, which is what we are talking about today. So because these types are built on continuums, you probably won't fall 100% into one type. You might fall between two or even between all four types. So I recommend that you take a mix and match approach to the different recommendations in these videos to sort of create your own process that works specifically for you. So you might feel that you're definitely an intuitive pantser, but you might also pick up some tips and tricks that would help you from the other videos because you probably aren't 100% intuitive and 100% a pantser. You probably fall a little bit off from the extreme sides of those spectrums. So I recommend that you do take a mix and match approach. I also want to mention that the intuitive pantser sort of tends to fall into a couple of different camps or personality types or creativity types. Some people fall into this type because if they plot in advance, they sort of lose that passion and spark for their project, so they have a hard time maintaining enthusiasm. For some writers, if they try to plot in advance or they try to use methodologies, it sort of stifles their creativity, so they end up with sort of a less inspired or less creative final product. So for some people, it's more psychologically motivated, I suppose, and for other people, it's sort of more creatively motivated, or not following intuition and not flying by the seat of their pants kind of reduces the quality of their output. So because of that, some tips are not going to apply to you, even if you feel very strongly that this is your type. And so I'm going to try to speak to both types of people and everyone who sort of falls in between. So just bear that in mind. I can't tell you exactly what you should do, and this is not intended to be prescriptive. These are just things I've seen work for other people that fall into this type. So let's go ahead and get right into the tips. Don't plot, but do brainstorm. It's sort of a given for this type that they're not going to plot. They're not going to plan their novels in advance. But we also often don't make a distinction between plotting and brainstorming. So though this type doesn't typically do well with plotting in advance, I still think that brainstorming in advance can be a really important part of the process for this type. So one of the main benefits of brainstorming is that when you are a discovery writer or you're a pantser, so you sort of learn about your story and grow in your understanding of your story as you write it, you can end up sometimes with a very long first draft. It might go off on tangents, it might be 300,000 or 400,000 words long, and that makes it really difficult when you go to the editing process because that's a lot to sift through. So one of the benefits of brainstorming for this type is that you can sort of play around in your world, sort of embody the characters, sort of live in the locations, and do a lot of that discovery before you write the first draft. It's not an attempt to make that first draft perfect by any means, but it will help you to not do all of your discovering while writing that first draft. So this will help you to build up your understanding in advance. There are lots of different ways you might go about this brainstorming. Most intuitive types probably have a good feel for what works for them already, but some things you might consider are listening to music that sort of has some sort of association maybe to a character or to specific scenes. You might try dancing to music, taking walks while listening to music. You might take walks while sort of trying to embody your character or sort of live in their head and sort of get into their mindset and their headspace. You might enjoy free writing. A lot of intuitive types don't prefer to write things down, but it is very dependent on the individual. So if writing things down works for you, doing some free writing might really help, just letting yourself sort of play around in the world, write about the characters and the locations and things like that. You might also find some low effort activities help to sort of open up your creativity. So things like taking showers, doing the dishes, coloring, those kinds of things can really help to allow you to brainstorm while sort of giving your hands something to do. So those are some recommendations, but typically I find with this type, they usually know what works well for them and really embrace what does work for you. So if that's coloring while listening to music, that's awesome. Do that and don't feel like, you need to have some sort of sophisticated process. Whatever ignites your creativity is absolutely perfect for this type. So doing that brainstorming, letting yourself live in the world, sort of develop your understanding of the characters, that's going to really help you to create a first draft that's a little bit more focused and maybe not quite so long and meandering. If you need more direction, ask questions. So the amount that this type is going to brainstorm will vary a lot, and some might like to do a little bit more focused brainstorming, or they might have a hard time with sort of centering their brainstorming on a particular topic, or they might have a hard time brainstorming certain aspects of the novel, or they might just sort of get to a point where they feel kind of stuck. They know they don't really feel like they're ready to write that first draft, but they don't really know what else to brainstorm or think about, especially because they're not going to be doing any plotting. So there's a list of questions that I developed that I think can help this type a lot. So I'm going to go over what those questions are, and you can sort of ask yourself these questions and do whatever type of brainstorming activity or method works for you. So that could be making a collage, making a playlist, taking a walk, just sort of meditating. Anything that works for you will be perfect. But these are some questions you can center those activities around if you need a little bit more focus. What does this character want more than anything else? What would most motivate this character to take action? What would stop this character from taking action? What is the worst thing that could happen to this character? What is the best thing that could happen to this character? Who or what is stopping this character from getting what they want? What does this character need to learn in order to be happy? I'm going to put that list of questions in the video description so you can copy and paste it and use it however you like. I do recommend that you not try to answer all the questions at once. I don't think that typically works very well for intuitive types. So maybe pick one question and just let yourself have some time to explore it and to use your brainstorming methods that work for you. Don't try to rush through and just slap down answers as fast as possible, because it's really important for you to really feel out and embody the character or be able to immerse yourself in the world. You don't want to just sort of slap down answers as fast as possible. That's really not going to be advantageous for this type. Activate your intuition at the start of every writing session. Sometimes a big struggle for this writing type is being able to get into the right headspace or being able to get motivated in order to work on their novel. So I recommend that you take a few minutes before each writing session to sort of activate your intuition and remind yourself of where you're going with the novel, what you wanted to accomplish. And you might not conceptualize this in very specific terms. It may be more of a feeling or an idea. And this is where your brainstorming materials can be extremely helpful. So looking at the collages you made, the playlist you created, pictures of your characters, anything that you have accumulated, so that you can sort of spark that intuition and remember what you were sort of going for and what you wanted to accomplish with this novel. So I find it extremely helpful for this process if you can gather all your materials in one sort of central location. I really like OneNote. I think it's very easy to gather up your information, and you can make folders or sort of tabs and then sub-tabs. So you end up able to make a lot of different character pages, location pages, things like that. But you should use whatever works for you. It could be Word documents, it could be Pinterest boards, it could be Scrivener, any sort of software, or it could be physical, whatever works for you. But I recommend that you gather those materials together so that you can spend a few minutes easily accessing and looking at them, especially the ones relevant to the scene that you're going to be writing or the character's perspective that you're going to be in, so you can really connect with and get into that mind space. And that often helps a lot with motivation and also just makes the writing process smoother. Read the previous chapter to reorient to your story. Because this type uses their intuition to determine the pacing and what should happen, it's really important that you be able to get back into the flow of the story. For many writers, a really good way to do this is to read the previous chapter or the previous couple chapters that they wrote, and that helps you to sort of pick up on the rhythm and the flow of the story. So it's sort of like hearing the first few notes of a song before you can sing along. You have to kind of assess what that song is, and then you'll know your timing and when you can come in if you're going to sing it or play an instrument. It's very similar to that. You need to be able to pick up on that rhythm and flow so that you can sort of jump in and take off and know where you're going and you hit the ground running. So if you take a long break from your novel, you might find it helpful to reread everything you've written so far, and then you can really pick up on that flow and that rhythm. And typically then with your intuition, you should have a much easier time knowing what should happen next, and it should help to reduce that feeling of getting stuck or sort of staring at a blank screen because you don't know what should happen. Because for the intuitive type, you really need to be able to dig into that rhythm and flow so that you know where you're going and what should happen next. Don't try to nail everything in the first draft. For many intuitive types, the first draft is a sort of process of learning about the characters and learning about the world. And because there's a lot of discovery happening and a lot of exploration happening, you can't possibly expect yourself to nail everything or even most things in the first draft. For most writers of this type, that first draft is going to be really big, it's going to be bloated, it's going to be meandering, there's going to be tangents, and that's okay. Let yourself have that time and that space to explore the characters, explore the world. Let your characters chat with each other, let them hang out with each other, and don't worry when you end up with a lot of material that you're ultimately not going to use. This is completely fine, and it's sort of essential to the process for many intuitive pantsers. So you might also find that you need to play out events for a longer amount of time than what's ultimately going to be included in the novel. So for example, maybe for your own immersion in the story, your own ability to connect with the character, you might start every day of the character's life from the beginning, and you might have them wake up and go about their task and describe their day at work and all of these events, when really it's just one crisis in the evening or one crisis at work or something that's really what the scene needs to center around. So you might end up with a lot of extra material, but if that material helps you to get into the headspace of the character, it helps you to sort of embody that character, it's completely fine. And you might not even realize when you're doing this until you go to edit and you realize, there's a lot of extra material that you don't need. But if you're the type that knows you do this, don't try to prevent yourself from doing it. Don't try to box yourself in or rein yourself in. Let yourself breathe. Give yourself the room that you need. Let the characters explore in their world. Write out scenes or days beginning to end if that's what you need to do, even if you're going to cut it down later. Do what you need to do so you can embody the character and immerse yourself in the world so that you can really ignite your intuition. Start editing by assessing how you feel about the first draft. So a couple years ago, I made a video about an editing technique that I think works really well for the intuitive pantser, and that technique focuses on all of the different elements of your novel and sort of labeling them. Do you love them? Do you hate them? Do you feel indifferent towards them? This can be a really helpful process for the intuitive pantser because it can help you to sort of break down the novel into parts without focusing on methodology. So it's still focused on intuition. Does this work? Do you like it? Does it not work? Do you hate it? And when you look at those things that you don't like, you can really start to think about why you don't like them and what you would need to replace them with in order to create a novel that you like more. So I recommend that you break down the different elements. These elements can include a variety of different things, including every character who appears in more than one scene, all major plot events or story events, any story threads or subplots, major settings, major pieces of backstory, the character arc or the character's lesson, significant objects. In sci-fi or fantasy, this might be significant concepts like the magic system or technology that's available. You might need to comb through your manuscript a little bit to pick out these different elements to make sure that you've included everything that you want to include, but just see how you feel about these things. Do they feel right? Do they feel wrong? sometimes when we look at the whole novel as just one big lump, it can be so overwhelming and so difficult to get a sense of how we feel about it. And if we don't like it, to even pinpoint what we don't like about it. So this can also help you to look at the things you do like, that you love about your novel. And that can help you to feel more positively as you work towards fixing all these things that didn't go the way that you want. I recommend that you watch the full video for more information about how this process would work. I also recommend in that video, and I do think this would be very helpful to the intuitive type, that you also look at things that you lost, things that never made it into the first draft. It's very common to intend a certain relationship or intend a certain subplot to play, a bigger role, but it just didn't work out that way when you wrote the actual first draft. So it's important to be honest with ourselves about that when something doesn't make it into the first draft, because you're never really going to be happy with the results if you don't find a way to integrate those things that really matter to you. So I recommend that you watch the original video for more information, but I do think that this is a technique that can be very helpful for the intuitive pantser. Get comfortable with throwing things away. I know it can be extremely difficult to let go of scenes or characters or subplots or anything. It's very hard to just throw material away, especially when you're an intuitive type. You might be writing material that feels very emotionally resonant or feels really important, but you know that it doesn't really fit into the story, or your intuition is telling you it's not really working, it really needs to go. It can be so difficult to let those things go. I think that this gets easier over time as you sort of trust yourself in the editing process and you see how much stronger your work is when you do cut things out. I also think it can be helpful to see that you're able to replace that, that scene that you love but doesn't fit with something else that you also love. So when you feel more confident in your ability to write material that you like, it becomes a lot easier to let go of material because you'll be able to replace it with something else. The reason I think this is so important for the intuitive pantser is that what I've often seen with this type is that they might spend years trying to polish a first draft to try to find some way that they can retain all of the characters and all of the scenes and all of the subplots and all of the ideas. And it just doesn't work out for them. They end up with a 300,000 word novel that they've spent 8 years on, and it's no closer to being published than when they started. So I know that it's really painful to let things go, but it's something to work towards for this type, because it's really going to move you so much faster towards your writing goals. And as hard as it can be, I really think you will be happier when you see a polished, nicely paced, finished product, even if that means letting go of some things that you really loved. Edit the big picture first. Because the intuitive pantser is so good on picking up on issues and sort of figuring out when the flow is off and when the word choices are off, they can get very distracted in the editing process, probably more so than any of the other types. And as a result, they can sometimes spend an enormous amount of time polishing smaller level issues before they've fixed the big picture issues. And so while I know it's very difficult for this type to do any sort of plotting or planning or methodologies, which is completely fine, you don't need to do that, I do recommend that you try to step back and look at the novel as a whole. You don't have to use structure to do this. You can use any method that you want. You could use flashcards. You could just use your list of things that you love and hate, and especially focus on the things that you hate about it or the things you're indifferent about, and think about, do you want to cut those things? Do you want to replace them with something else? You could also use summaries, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the video later on. You could use summaries to help to sort of look at the big picture, but try to start with the big problems or the big things that you need to polish or that you want to change. So characters that you want to cut or remove, locations that you want to cut or remove, major plot line changes. You're going to change the motivation of the antagonist, or you're going to change the location of the climax, or you're going to add a major twist. All of those elements, anything that's going to have a sort of ripple effect out through the whole book, those things need to be focused on first. This is one of the only areas where the intuitive pantser is going to have a lot of control over efficiency. Your editing style is not probably going to be very efficient compared to the other writing types, and that's totally fine. But this is an area where you can improve your efficiency quite a bit by just making sure that you get all of those really big picture elements in order first. And it's your choice if you want to get them in order in the novel itself, so you want to actually edit the actual book, or if you want to sort of write it out, write a summary or a revision plan, and then you could still go through in chronological order and make those changes beginning to end rather than making all the big picture changes at once. So it's up to you how you want to go about it, but I highly recommend that you start with the big picture before you move on to any of the smaller level issues. Hack your intuition with summaries. So sometimes you're going to have a novel that's so complicated and so big that you can't reasonably rely on your brain to hold all of that information at once. To activate your intuition, you have to be able to get perspective on what you're working on. And that can just be impossible for some novels. Not because there's any deficiency in the writer's ability to be intuitive, but just because it's just too much information. So a really good way, if you're falling into this, a really good way that you can sort of hack your brain is to create summaries or short stories that cover specific aspects of your novel. So this could be the emotional arc of a character or the emotional growth of a character. You might just write that alone as a sort of short story. It might be a relationship between two characters. You might sort of write that out beginning to end as a short story. You might do that with the core plot line. You might do that from the antagonist perspective if you want to make sure that you're getting that correct, like such as the antagonist location or what the antagonist knows at various points. You can sort of write that out as a short story. Anything that you can do to sort of break the novel up into smaller parts that are more digestible, it's going to help you so much with activating your intuition rather than needing to look at the whole novel at once. Another option would be sort of speed reading the novel. So you sort of read it as quickly as possible so that you can get through it all in one sitting and you can sort of take notes as you go. This can be really overwhelming for some people, so it's sort of up to you if you think that's something that would work for you or not. If you go with the summary route, you can sort of tweak that summary or that sort of short story-like summary. So you don't want to make it a overly clinical or something that you would share with an agent or a publisher, for example, but something that really speaks to you emotionally, makes sense to you, something that really ignites your creativity and your emotions. If you look at that, you can tweak it until it feels right, because you should be able to look at that shorter version and get your intuition sparked and sort of feel out the flow and the rhythm, as well as how it fits into your story, how it fits into your vision and your goals for the book. And that can be a great way to prepare yourself for the editing process or to make a plan for the editing process and to just better grasp those big, hard to understand elements of the novel that can be really, really hard to use intuition on when you're just looking at the whole book. Work deeply on smaller sections. So another way that you can make your novel editing process more accessible, more digestible, is you can break the novel down into smaller sections. So these sections don't have to have anything to do with structure. Just break it down into sections that make logical sense to you. So this could be a 5-chapter sequence that all takes place in the same location. It could be the section before your character meets another character. It could be the section between meeting a character and falling in love with the character. It could be the section before they meet the antagonist. It could be a section while they're trapped in a certain location. Any way you can break it down. It could be different locations, could be different goals or different emotional contexts. Whatever makes sense to you on an intuitive level is perfect. Use those smaller sections to be able to dive in and sort of build up the novel brick by brick. So maybe you can break down the first section of your novel however it makes sense to you. It could be a chapter, it could be 4 chapters, it could be 8 chapters, and really polish that, get it exactly the way that you want it to be. And by looking just at that section, you'll be able to ignite your intuition, because it should be a section that you can read in one sitting, and that will help you to sort of read it through, make tweaks, read it through and make tweaks, read it through and make tweaks until it really feels exactly like what you want it to be. don't be afraid of a trial and error approach. Often for this type, seeing is believing, and they really won't be able to tell if moving a scene to a different location works unless they actually physically move it there. Or they might not be able to tell if a different motivation for a character works unless they actually write the scene with a different motivation. So even though you might feel like this is not efficient, it's not an ideal way to go about the process, it doesn't matter what's ideal. What matters is what you can do and what you will be able to follow through with and what works for your brain and for your creative style. So don't be afraid to use trial and error. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not be sure, if I move the scene here, is it really going to make sense? Is it really going to work? Just move it there. And you'll probably find that you need to integrate it better. So you might need to change the lead into the scene and sort of what leads out of the scene and some little details here and there so that it feels native to its new location. You probably need to do that before you'll be able to even tell if that scene really works there or not. And that's completely fine. It's not a waste of time as long as it moves you closer to, discovering the best option for you or polishing your novel. And even if it's just a process of elimination, you move a scene to a new spot and then it tells you, it didn't work. So then that's new information that you have that you can use to move forward. So it's completely fine. I often find trial and error works really well for this type. So if you can take a sort of looser, playful approach to the editing process, don't be afraid to try pulling out a character and see, how does the scene feel if this character's not in it anymore, or put a different character into that scene and see, how does it play out? What's the difference between those two and which do you like better? What works better? Taking that more open, playful trial and error approach is often really, really helpful for this type. Label and save everything. Sometimes when you're editing on intuition, it's easy to make a lot of changes really rapidly. Often the intuitive types can kind of be working on a lot of different things at once, and their intuition is sort of saying, move this sentence and move this paragraph and move this scene and take this character and do this. And that can sometimes end up with a draft that's suddenly very different from the previous draft. And that could be for better or it could be for worse, because if we're doing or taking a trial and error approach, sometimes that's not going to work. So the trial and error, it's not going to work out, and we're going to decide, that's not what I want, that doesn't make sense, it doesn't work with the flow, etc. So I highly recommend that you save many, 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 many versions of your novel and label them all very clearly so that you know what version you're looking at. Because what can happen is you might move a scene to a new location and then decide, actually, that doesn't work and I'm going to pull it out and move it to another location. Then later on, you take a different scene and move it to a new location. And then suddenly you're like, wait, that scene that I moved earlier before, I want to move it earlier again. But then you've already done that work, but you can't find it, or you didn't save it. So what I recommend is that you save your versions with very distinct and clear names. So you might name it version that starts on the island, version that starts at the castle, or you might even label or save individual scenes outside of or separate from your main document. Probably you'll want to do a mix of both full manuscript saves as well as scene experiment saves, so just saving that one scene. So you might have the falling in love scene, and you might have falling in love scene version that takes place at dinner, and falling in love scene version where Max is the antagonist, and falling in love scene version where Abby's the antagonist. And saving all of those different versions will give you options, so when you end up doing that trial and error or wanting to revert back to something else that you've tried previously, you have that option and all of that is saved and easily at your fingertips. Except that two good ideas can be incompatible. Sometimes one of the hardest things for the intuitive types is that their intuition might be telling them that this idea works and this idea works, but they don't work together. And sometimes there is no way that two concepts or ideas are ever going to make sense together or in the same book. So for example, maybe one of your ideas is that you want the character arc to be related to the character learning to not be so greedy, so they learn to be more giving. But the climax that you have requires the character do something that's really greedy in order to succeed. These things are going to almost definitely feel like they're in contradiction with each other. They might both work really well. They might be two really good ideas, but they don't work together. And you might find that this happens a lot. You might have ideas for scenes that could play out one way or another way, but you can't do both within the same scene. So often then you're needing to pick between two ideas that both work, but then how do you pick? How do you know what the best option is if both are good options? So when you find yourself in this circumstance, I recommend that you go back to your brainstorming materials. Look at your collages, listen to your playlist, look at the pictures of your characters, whatever you used to brainstorm, whatever helps you to get into that headspace and to sort of engage with those characters on an emotional level and feel immersed in the world. And try to, from that sort of immersed state, figure out what works best for you and which option you like the best. Don't worry about what option you think other people will like the best. Usually with intuitive types, this is a good way to sort of screw up their intuition if they're trying to think what's the most commercial option or what option is going to make other people like this story the best. That can kind of overshadow or stifle their intuition. So that doesn't usually work too well. So try to pick what works best for what you want to accomplish with your novel and what you like the most. And if you're really, really stuck on two incompatible options, you can do the old flip a coin trick, which is, flip a coin and you'll know immediately if that was the outcome that you wanted or not, because you're going to be disappointed if it lands on the thing that you don't want. So try to open yourself up to what you really want and what you really want to do with your novel when you're faced with those two incompatible options. Remember, there's no right answer. Building off of the idea of choosing between two incompatible options, it's important to keep in mind that there is no right way to edit your novel. You're not looking to find the right way or the correct way. Everybody likes different things. Everybody even likes different things about the same books. I've often been surprised when, I talk about novels that I love with other people. They might love those novels for completely different reasons than I do. You're not going to please everybody, and you're not going to write a version of this novel that's the most correct or the most right version. All writers would come up with a different version of the same exact story. They would emphasize different things, highlight different things, try it, use a different tone or focus on a different emotion. You're not looking for the right answer. You're just looking for a cohesive story that works with what you like, that when you read it, your intuition tells you, this is good and I don't have any problems with this. I like it. I like the flow. I like the characters. I like what I'm seeing. This type can sometimes get a little bit maybe anxious or a little bit maybe preoccupied with how other people are going to feel about the story or what other people are going to think. And I think that can be a really hard and difficult thing to overcome. It can be very difficult to open up your ideas and your emotions to other people. And I think it can be very vulnerable when you use your intuition because maybe you feel a little bit more of an emotional attachment to this work and it might be very important to you. But there isn't a right way. It's most important that you're happy with what you're working on because especially for this type, they really struggle with following through with projects that they're not enthusiastic about and that they're not excited about. So if you try to make decisions thinking that this is the right way or this is the way it should be, you're more likely to be disappointed with the outcome, and that's likely to result in you not wanting to follow through with the writing process or getting anxious or frustrated or stressed about the writing process and not finishing the novel. So keep in mind there is not a right way, but your intuition should be able to guide you towards a strong, cohesive story. If you get stuck, it's okay to look at methodology. One of the most frustrating issues for this type is when they intuitively know that something is wrong, but they can't figure out what it is. They might go over it and over it. They might try, making summaries. They might try talking it out with somebody. They might try looking at their collages and listening to their songs or whatever creative methods they use, and they might still not be able to figure it out. Something just doesn't feel right, and they're not able to put into words or specifics what the issue is. If this happens to you, it's okay to use methodologies. It doesn't mean you're not intuitive. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. And it doesn't mean you have to use methodologies in the future. It doesn't even mean that you need to be able to explain your ultimate choice based on the methodology that you use. So maybe you read, for example, some information about story structure. So say you're really struggling with something around the middle of your novel. You can't really figure out what's wrong. So you sort of read theories about sort of what's supposed to go on around the midpoint or what the midpoint is all about. Maybe that sparks intuition for you. You come up with an idea. Maybe you can't actually explain how it fits at all with what you read. You can't necessarily put into words why this is structurally a midpoint according to the methodology, but you know that it works because your intuition is telling you that it works. I find that this is often the case for intuitive types, is that they can't really explain why a certain thing works, but sometimes still reading about those methodologies can be very helpful in understanding what they need to do or where they need to go, and it can kind of work to unstick them if they get stuck. So don't be afraid to do that if you get stuck. It can be very helpful. Those methodologies are there to help you, so don't be afraid to use them to your advantage. I am working on a series about story structure that focuses sort of on the in-between sections between the main plot points and sort of what's going on emotionally, and I think that could be very helpful for some intuitive types, especially if they're getting stuck, sort of the vibe feels wrong in certain sections, but they're not really sure why, so the emotion feels off or the vibe feels off. I think that series could be really helpful, so check that out if you think that's something that could help. But also there's plenty, lots and lots of different videos and books and things you can use to just dabble a little bit in methodology, only if you get stuck, to a point where you feel like you're frustrated and your intuition isn't taking you where you want to go. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this video helpful. If you're an intuitive pantser and you have any ideas or recommendations or suggestions, please put those in the comments for other people to use and hopefully benefit from. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the comments as well, and I will try to answer them if they're not too long. If you want to help support me, I do have a Patreon. We do a Q&A over there once a month. It's a really good time, and you can ask questions about your writer type or your book or whatever you like. So if you want to check that out, it's much appreciated. I'll put a link in the description. So I will see you all again soon, and in the meantime, happy writing.